Well, good afternoon, everyone. We want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. I've known a lot of you on this call for many years, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Keith Alberts. I'm the Marketing and Information Technology Director at TPS. I worked directly with TPS for 13 years, and prior to that, about 8 years through their third-party administrator, so altogether about 21 years. Before we jump into the presentation, I wanted to give you just a little background on the history of the crisis coverage that TPS has offered throughout the years. In response to member demand, TPS started providing crisis coverage in conjunction with its property casualty coverages in February 1st of 2016. Coverage was placed at that time with Tokyo Marine, and it remained until April 1st of this year. Now, Tokyo was a great partner for 6 years, but they chose to increase their renewal premium by 245% and significantly changed their terms. And yes, you heard me correctly, 245%. So faced with that, we hit the market and ultimately partnered with Beazley. And we're happy to report that Beazley's terms and coverage are far superior than Tokyo's was. So that's good news for TPS members. With that, I'd like to turn it over to the experts at Beazley and crisis risk, but first I need to back up. If you guys have any questions during the presentation, feel free to type them in the chat, and we'll try to get to those questions as quickly as possible. So.
Perfect. Thank you, Keith. Thank you all for those of you who are joining us today. We're delighted to be here and able to present to TPS and the members. I'm Lucy Straker. I've been at Beazley for 9 years. Within the political violence and deadly weapon protection portfolio. Primarily, I was hired to start up the standalone terrorism book based out of New York, and then I went back to London, and I've recently moved back to Charleston, South Carolina. So I had the pleasure of spending time with TPS last week. I'm joined by Susie from Crisis Risk, who is one of our partners within this space, and we're delighted to have her here. She is one of the founding members of Crisis Risk. So for those individuals who purchase the Beazley Deadly Weapon Protection product, you deal with Susie before, during, and after an event as well. Next slide, please, Susie.
Thanks, Lucy.
Today we're going to focus on prevention of violence. One of the key things about Beazley's product and why it's so unique compared to the rest of our peers is we really want to focus on eliminating and doing anything possible to prevent a deadly weapon event occurring. We're going to look at some lessons learned, how and what and why ultimately individuals might take that path to violence, and what you as an organization can do about it. We'll talk about what's available within the space and why this product is developed. But if you do have further questions about how this product might work for you and what you have ultimately purchased under TPS, then speak to Keith, and we can also arrange further education sessions as well. So the first slide I'd like to draw your attention to is what we call a trend in the changing face of terrorism. If you cast your mind back to post 9/11, what we saw was the actual day-to-day threat to the US tended to be another 9/11 type event. It was sophisticated in nature. The aim was to cause mass physical damage, mass human catastrophe, and ultimately it was carried out by members of recognized terrorist groups. What you've seen over the past 10 years or so is a massive increase in what we call lone wolf type attacks. So ultimately, by comparison, these events tend to be less sophisticated, they use readily available materials, and they occur far more frequent, and their severity, depending on the nature, may be lesser so from a physical damage standpoint. The aim of the human catastrophe is still there as well. So we've seen the trend go from, the sophisticated attack to people using guns, people using chemicals if you're based in the UK, people using vehicles, again, if you're based in Europe, the UK, the US, syringes, knives, you name it, whatever is available is ultimately deemed to be a deadly weapon event in today's day and age. Next slide, please. So what do we see in the US today? I think before we go further into the statistics, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that actually when we talk about violence in the US, a lot of the people are looking towards a mass shooting. So what ultimately is a mass shooting? For the media, for the FBI, and for the Gun Violence Archive, we see a mass shooting as 4 or more people shot or killed, excluding the perpetrator. That is 4 or more people. So often when you see the FBI data, or the Gun Violence Archive data, or the stats on this slide here saying that there were 693 mass shootings in the US in 2021, that figure is only ever going to include events that have 4 or more people shot or killed. So the actual day-to-day violence in the US is far greater than the figures that you see here. Back in 2019, we saw an emergence of the figures increasing so that we had 1 mass shooting a day in the US. Susie will remember, and I told Keith as well, that actually I remember when we sat around as a team in one of our weekly meetings, we were shocked as to how that figure had got so high, when it got so high, and what could be done about it. Unfortunately, as you can see from the statistics on this slide here, that trend upwards has only escalated further. So in 2021, we had the most violent year on record with 58 mass shootings per month in the US. That is a horrifying number. 2022, at present, is trending between 2020 and 2021. So unprecedented levels of violence, and unfortunately for businesses, now they can't afford to look away. They now need to purchase a product that protects them from the level of violence we see on a day-to-day basis within the US.
And Lucy, specifically for schools in Texas, on average for about the past 5 years, there's been 3 shootings a year in Texas in schools. So it's definitely on the rise.
And I think, Keith, I've told you about, it was March 2020. I find this statistic so shocking every time that it took a national lockdown from COVID for there not to be a school, a mass shooting in a school in the month of March. And it was only because of a global pandemic, which is utterly horrifying.
Okay. You know, I want to pick up on something Keith said before we dive into the rest of these. Obviously, the threat of violence is something that every organization faces. You know, Keith, when you gave the statistic about the 3 shootings in Texas, the 3 school shootings, if you think about that, you know, we've all become so desensitized to these events because they're so frequent, but yet putting it in context, you know, that's 3 communities destroyed. That's 3, however many numbers of injured and fatalities in those schools, families destroyed. Their world is never again the same. No child ever feels safe for a period of time. Every parent worries about sending their kid to school. So the ripple effect of a shooting is so far beyond just the impacted location where it occurred. So to, you know, when Lucy talks about this coverage and the reason we Crisis Risk partnered with Beazley in creating the product and in, you know, managing the types of services that we could offer, the goal was solely focused on prevention. Yes, it's great to have an indemnification cover. It's great to be able to be compensated if something happens. But at the end of the day, there's no amount of money that replaces your people, your brand, your reputation, all of those things. So as important as the coverage is from the liability side, you know, our focus with this product is how do we do what we can to help organizations that purchase the cover enhance their, we call it a violence protection program. How do we enhance your program to make you more resilient to the threat of violence and to prepare your people to respond if, you know, God forbid it does occur. So, you know, look, we can't deny it. Violence is everywhere and no organization is immune. And sadly, we've really all become so conditioned to it because we hear about it on the news. And unless it happens in our backyard, you know, you can turn your TV off. We can move on unless we're the ones impacted. You know, I shared this one social media post because I think it kind of illustrates it. If you take a look here, this was a police department that was sending out a notification that there was 4 victims taken to the hospital, lots of police resources on scene after a shooting. Traffic is not affected at this point. And someone writes, oh, thank God traffic was not affected, was worried for a second. I mean, it just shows you, you know, how even they thought to string together 4 people shot and yet traffic not affected. So this all contributes to this, you know, insensitivity that we're all starting to develop. I'm just going to call out a few different events just to show you kind of how, you know, Lucy gave you those numbers about 53 or 58 per month, but many of those are these mass shootings. You know, the King Soopers, if you remember that shooting in Colorado, 10 people were killed. If you look at what happened before that shooting, and you'll all get the slides, so you don't have to worry about having a close read of what's on here, but if you look at it, that shooting was the 7th mass shooting in 7 days. And then take a look at what happened the week after. You had every single day, virtually, a shooting and a mass shooting in office complexes, nightclubs, convenience stores, party buses, social clubs. So it truly is everywhere. And we have to really take a step back and say, you know, what's going on? You know, why? What's changing? What's happening in our society? What's making the numbers go up? And of course, we've all lived through the last couple of years, which have been super challenging. You know, it just compounds the stressors that many people already had in place before the pandemic. And that ranges from financial challenges, mental health issues, substance abuse, domestic violence. All of these have gone up, by the way, during the pandemic. And then, you know, it hasn't been helpful to have such political polarization and extremism and rise in hate crimes. So I think what you're seeing is a very unstable environment that we're all living in. And if you are already a person that has underlying issues, you are much more vulnerable eventually to potentially being a perpetrator. We have this saying in crisis risk, we use this metaphor of someone sitting on the fence. What we mean is that there are a certain number of people who work for your organizations, whether you're a school, you're a municipality, a transit authority, whatever role you're sitting in as you watch this webinar, there are people working with you, for you, around you, who are already sitting on that fence, meaning they are vulnerable to, they may be dealing with alcohol and drug issues, they may be dealing with spousal abuse, domestic violence, financial challenges. And a certain number of those people get pushed too far. And that is when they may perpetrate an act of violence. So does it mean that every person who's got a substance abuse problem is going to, you know, come to work with a gun and shoot someone? Of course not. But it does mean that there are many people around us who are kind of on that fine line. We had an opportunity to see it in real time. For those of you who might have watched the Oscars, this is some photos, you know, that Reuters published in the moment when Will Smith, you know, struck Chris Rock during the Oscars. And I think there's really, this is a very good example of someone getting pushed off the fence. You don't often get to see this live in front of millions, maybe billions of people who watch the Oscars. So you have to ask yourself, what was going on in his life that would have led him to a place where he would risk his career, his family, his everything, his reputation, to do this action? So something significant was underlying his existence that pushed him off that fence. So it's important to really understand, do we have triggers in our work environments that in and of themselves add to someone's stress? You know, many of you are organizations, you're serving the public. You may be dealing with social service programs. You may be working with unstable or violent persons. You may be dealing with prisons or probation. Many of you could be located in high crime areas where just in and of itself, you're more vulnerable to acts of violence. You know, one of the ones that is really probably one of the biggest contributors to targeted workplace violence would be having a toxic or bureaucratic culture. Employees that seek vengeance through actions of workplace violence are usually people who have either been bullied, who have some type of a grievance that they feel is unresolved. They don't feel they've been treated fairly by a supervisor or a superior. So if you're working in a toxic environment, a bureaucratic environment where things just don't get done, where people are frustrated, your environment is at a higher risk for violence.
Susie, what about children who might have like unstable homes, fragmented, like, you know, when they leave school at the end of the day, they should be going back to a safe, stable environment, and that might not necessarily be the case for a lot of children, especially in some of the lower economic areas where some schools might be based, etc. How's that then going to spill out into the day-to-day?
You're absolutely right, Lucy. And you know, look, many perpetrators, they don't wake up one morning and just decide to come in with a gun. There's been a path, you know, to violence that sometimes is over years. And when we think about children, especially now, the pandemic really, for homes that were already abusive, the domestic violence statistics, you know, have gone way up. And children are the victims. You know, children are dealing with either abusive parents. They may be malnourished. They may be dealing with a drug environment, whatever. So, you know, I don't know if you saw statistics, but the pediatric hospital emergency room visits has gone through the roof. And in our nation, we're not equipped to deal with, we don't have the numbers of beds needed to service the needs of pediatric mental health patients. So what you're describing is absolutely a reality that people are confronting, and it's an important thing to take note of and figure out. You know, every school, every youth organization has to have an increased awareness about this additional stress that our students are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And in fact, you will see this slide will show you, you know, people often ask, well, can you predict who is going to come with a weapon? You know, is there one behavior? Is there one signal that we can take note of? When it comes to mass shootings, in particular, what we see, and these are, you know, really related to many of the, including the recent ones, they tend to have an experience with childhood trauma, like we were just talking about. It might be domestic violence, a parent suicide. They also will experience some type of a personal crisis or a specific grievance, like they were bullied or fired from a job. They become actively suicidal. Most of these shooters are actively suicidal. You've heard the phrase death by cop. They want to die. They're ready to take others with them in some cases. They tend to leave a script or a manifesto. We often see the publication of the writings of these individuals. And of course, access to a firearm. But I think what I want to make very clear to everyone watching this is that, as Lucy said, the 600 and plus that we had, those are the mass shootings, meaning 4 or more. These are not the vast majority of workplace violence events. They are the mass majority, in the tens of thousands are one victim. And if that one person works for you or is your family member or your student, that is enough. That I can assure you, we've responded to events ranging from, you know, the shootings at Virginia Tech in 2007 to a shooting of one student at a high school in Colorado and everything in between. And the school in Colorado losing one student, it may as well have been 10 or 20. There's no difference. Yes, difference in the magnitude of the other families impacted, but it changed the world for everyone in that environment. And I think we all need to be motivated to prevent just the one. We don't need to only be thinking about, you know, the mass numbers. So,
Susie, to your point,
yeah, go ahead.
Just your point, so a couple of things. Firstly, for those that you've said, obviously, the one. If you go on the gun violence archive, it will tell you how many gun-related incidents there are in the US. And roughly there's around 65,000 a year. So to your point, again, compared to the 600 we're talking 65,000 gun-related incidents. And that will include gang violence, armed robberies, suicide, etc.
Right.
But it is just a shocking figure. And then just going back on your couple of slides prior, where you said obviously about, those who carry out shootings tend to be victims of bullying. I think one of the things we find super interesting, and we're talking about a lot between Beazley and crisis risk, is that social media element. And I know Keith has heard me speak about this before, but one of the things that children are seeing today is you can't escape. So previously when I went to school, I didn't have social media. I left school at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, whenever my parents wanted to pick me up. And if I was being bullied, that was when it ended. I went home and I had, 12 hours at least of just calm, where I wasn't stressing about, what was going to happen to me in the corridor, like if I was being bullied. And now what we're seeing is children who are on social media, you can't escape. You leave school at 5 o'clock and there is no relief. That bullying happens online. It's your friends or your so-called friends posting stuff on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, whatever it might be, of what they're doing without you. Or they're picking on you through various like Snapchat mediums. And it is just constantly relentless. So much so that I think, we've discussed a lot as well in the past couple of years, teen suicide rates have just gone through the roof as well. And a lot of that, they're saying, actually is due largely in part due to the influence that social media is playing in today's society.
You're right. And when you think about the bullying you described as a young girl in your community, you got home, it stopped. But here with social media, the breadth, the amount of people that can participate is unlimited, because it's not just local. People bully each other online, and the potential is there for anyone else online to join in. So there are a lot of Lucy and I have done other presentations on this topic, and we've presented data that shows the change in the emotional state of our youth and our teens in America. And, all roads sadly lead back to this being exacerbated by all of these mediums through social media. So yeah, I think for every organization dealing with youth in particular, paying close attention, having social media policies, having a way to monitor the online behavior of your students, of your employees is very, very important. And you'll hear why. It's a good segue, because we're going to talk about some of these warning signs, and you're going to see that if you're paying attention and looking for them, you'll be able to recognize them and you'll be able to do something about it. Because as we said earlier, these perpetrators, they're on a path. They don't just wake up and snap. Again, weeks, years, months. So in order to disrupt their plan, and by the way, they do plan, we need to recognize and report the behaviors and do something about it. So let's take a look at a little bit about the behavioral warning signs. Again, no one sign's predictive. People usually exhibit multiple warning signs, and I describe it like, I don't know if this slide has it, let's just see a dot on a page that, yeah, it'll come up, that they may present different behaviors over different periods of time. And if you had the ability to track them, you would ultimately get to a place where you're seeing a picture of a person who might be on a path to violence. But again, you have to recognize that they need to be recognized, they need to be reported, they need to be aggregated, and then you can respond. It's interesting. One of the behavioral risk tools that we recommend every organization have is what we call a central repository. So picture someone recognizes warning signs, they report them, but those signs need to be aggregated somewhere in a repository. One of the lessons learned we had with a school in Colorado following a shooting, there was the perpetrator was an individual who had lots of issues. And, a teacher noted something, a security guard noted something, a parent called in about something. The school tracked all these events chronologically. They didn't alphabetize them. They didn't group them by student name. So when you're just tracking something chronologically, you never get to connect these dots. So if you are an organization that is tracking incidents, events, reports, remember it's really important to be able to look at them many different ways. So if you're doing it chronologically, it doesn't afford you the opportunity to group things by person, and that's really what is needed in a repository. One thing I want to kick off right away to get out of everyone's minds is that this is a mental health problem. Mental health is not a predictor of future violence. Now, that said, 50% of Americans at some point in their history have had problems with mental health. So to say that it doesn't play a role is not the total story. But what we do know from the studying that was done of these mass shooters in particular, the percentage of them who were directly motivated as a result of a mental disorder is smaller than those motivated by hate, a workplace grievance, or some interpersonal conflict. So mental health is not an excuse. We can't just write everything off, well, that person's crazy, that person's out of their mind. That's just really not the case. That's just way too easy to get everybody off the hook. The reality is we really need to start looking and understanding other behaviors. So and by the way, these slides I'm going through, we have a training module called Behavioral Risk Awareness that's available to all Beazley insureds. And there's no fee for it. You can access it online, and you can, if you like what you see, you can make it available to all your people. But so these are some things we cover in that training. But I want everyone to know that there's a continuum. There's a spectrum of behavior that ranges from, watching someone act in an unusual way that just makes you uncomfortable, to outright threats, which are, if they're direct threats, the most dangerous type of warning sign. What we do know about most school shooters in particular is that, and not just school shooters, but in particular they've studied these, so we have actual data that school shooters will leak their plans 80% of the time. And Lucy, going back to social media, typically they leak it on social media. So if you're monitoring and you have keyword phrases and things within your organization, you may pick up on that with some of your students, your employees. This one happened to be the El Paso shooter, the Walmart shooting, if you remember that, where he basically came out and said, he put it out there, I'm committing a hate crime tonight. 3 more days after my probation, I get my AR-15 back. So again, if someone's looking and listening, there's an opportunity.
Susie, going back to that, if you go back to that slide,
sure.
What you see is that you've had 12 people like, love, laugh, whatever, respond to it, 24 on the one below, and 3 comments. Every single one of those responses could have been someone who could have reported it.
You're 100% right. And reporting, you'll see, is really like the biggest barrier to getting to the prevention. People tend to be concerned about reporting unless they can do so anonymously. People don't want to, you remember snitches get stitches, and that's how kids grow up. They don't want to associate themselves with being the person who, ratted out their friend. In the adult world, people are very aware often of these behaviors, or they're aware, for example, that Mary might be a victim of domestic violence. Why should we care about Mary being a victim of domestic violence? Because, by the way, domestic violence is the leading cause of death of women in the workplace. So if Mary is a victim at home and her spouse or domestic partner chooses to, settle his affairs with Mary, the best place to do that, he knows where she is all the time. She's at work, whether that's in the parking lot, wherever that may be. I say she because while it's not unheard of to have it go the other way, where the woman is the perpetrator, it's typically the man. So we need to think about how do we set up our culture to be an environment where people feel safe to report and know that you're going to do something about it if in fact they get the nerve to come forward. Again, this is just the leakage in school attacks, as I mentioned. It's more than 80% of the time the shooter's told at least one person. 59% of the time it's 2 or more people. So we need to start finding a way to break down the barriers between our students and helping them to understand that their safety and everyone's safety hinges on them coming forward. Sometimes though, and I've responded to student suicides and shootings, and I will tell you that when kids hear other kids verbalize their intent to do something, often they think it's a joke. Like they don't take it seriously. If Tommy says, I'm going to kill myself, and then he says, I'm just joking. I can tell you that it's never a joke. People don't just make statements like that. There's something behind it, and there's something that has to be taken very seriously. And again, it's back to that reporting. So what we try to do in the training is encourage people that you have to come forward if you hear something or say something. And we as organizations that employ people, all of you listening, it's very important that you find a way to develop an anonymous reporting protocol, tools that can give people the ability to come forward. And it doesn't have to be complicated. Yes, there are plenty of apps and encrypted text messaging and things like that that will raise people's trust level in the anonymous nature of it, but it's not an excuse that you can't implement technology like that, because sometimes it could be as simple as a suggestion box that people can put a note in. So there are ways to structure anonymous reporting, and that's something we cover with the Beazley insureds when we talk to them about their violence protection program, as we call it. So I won't spend much time on these, but just to let you know, again, the spectrum ranges from very direct threats to suicidality, as we talked about. Nearly 70% of shooters are suicidal before shooting. And as we mentioned earlier, the numbers are even higher for school shooters. So one of the cases, I know we wanted to cover some of the lessons learned and some of the events that have already occurred. I don't know how many of you remember the shooting at a FedEx facility in Indianapolis last year. In this case, this was a gunman. He was an employee there, and he had pretty much voiced his desire to die almost daily to his family, to some of his friends. And in 2020, his mother actually contacted the police to warn them that her son had purchased a weapon and that his intent was, quote, to die by suicide by cop. So the police went to his home. They did the wellness check. They did find the weapons, and they temporarily, held him on a 72-hour hold for mental health reasons, which, law enforcement can do if they believe that the person poses a risk, or at least long enough to get them evaluated. And he was successful in downplaying his suicidal thoughts and his plans, and he was released. So when he came to work that day, he wasn't really targeting any individual, but he did want to die. And, he was going to go out with a bang. So he took, 10 other people with him, ranging from 19 to 74. Again, this was a person who was on the radar, who was, being observed, but unfortunately, he was also successful in convincing people that he just didn't have an issue. So again, I am sure if we look back, there are many warning signs that that young man exhibited in the workplace that perhaps weren't, detected or reported. So you're going to hear me sound like a broken record. Again, all roads lead back to that. Sometimes you have one of the other big warning signs is a person who's really showing a fascination with violence. You'll see maybe they're talking about collecting guns, or they're showing an extreme, like overly extreme interest in past violence events that have happened. They talk about it a lot. One of the, the clear warning signs that's just not normal behavior is people who direct their violence toward animals or inanimate objects. In the Parkland school shooting, there was an example where the shooter had, brought a severed head of an animal to school one day. It was not, for biology class. It was just it's hard to describe what it was, other than it just evidenced his cruelty. And again, from that case, which I know all of you have probably read a lot about, there were many, many signs. Now, not to say many efforts weren't made to address them, they were. But but these are just some of the learnings. People who are threatening and intimidating in the workplace, that is not normal behavior. That should not be acceptable behavior. People, we all know these people. They're the kind of people who always challenge authority. They second guess everything they're told. They insist they're always right. They just hold grudges, and sometimes they'll even say, boy, I hope he gets hers or she gets hers. Things like that. Again, not normal behavior. So how do you know when you should report it? Well, at this point, if someone's acting like this, I think it is something you would bring to someone's attention. Now, sometimes you can go through normal supervisory channels, tell your boss, tell his supervisor. But again, if you're not willing to report because you don't want to be associated with it, or maybe you just feel like you could be wrong, you do it anonymously. But all of these types of behaviors, as you learn about them, you'll start to recognize them when you see them. You'll know they're not normal. And they may just, again, be one of those dots I showed you on the page. So let's take that example. You remember the rail yard shooting in 21 in Santa Clara? I don't know. There's so many of these that I could see how people say, boy, I forgot about that one, because it's just constant. So in this case, this was, this was a government agency. An employee ended up killing 9 of his coworkers. But what's so important about this is, if you look back at what the FBI learned and what the employer said, this person was acting out for 10 years. People were afraid. He scares me. If someone was going to go postal, it would be him. These are the kind of comments people made. And this guy expressed his hatred and his resentment of his workplace over and over again. He was also the kind of person that would have these angry outbursts, and especially after drinking. So that back to that substance abuse issue, not to make light of that. Substance abuse, again, alone, in and of itself, one behavior to look at, but it often will exacerbate some of the other things that are happening. So taking action, whether that's through HR, whether that's, some of us are lucky to work in places where we have EAPs, where you could have, anger management, different things. But this is a person who, frankly, was allowed to just continue for a decade misbehaving and not getting the intervention that was indicated or may have been indicated.
Susie, out of all the Beazley incidents that we've had since we've been writing the policy, out of interest, like how many of them have those dots?
How many have those dots?
Yeah, all the perpetrators that we look at. Because I think it's important for people on the call to know that, when you're purchasing a Beazley product, like we have responded to claims, we continue to respond to claims, like we work very closely with crisis risk. But actually, again, after every claim, we look at lessons learned. We work out how to better ourselves and our policy and our offering. But as one of those lessons learned, how many of those perpetrators have left a trail?
Oh, all of them, Lucy. They all do. But sometimes the challenge is that the trail might be with their family or with their friends. It doesn't always get to be visible in the workplace or in the school. But over time, the answer is all of them. And I think, I know you're going to cover this later and I know we're getting short on time, so I'm going to speed up, but you're going to cover the value of the circumstance endorsement in the Beazley policy. And what I want everyone to know when Lucy describes what that circumstance endorsement is, just remember that all of these moments when we're talking to you about warning signs and things you may observe, this policy allows you to call us 24/7 to seek input if you are concerned about an individual you think may be on a path to violence. And what we're going to do 24/7 is help you determine the threat level and try to figure out what are the next steps we can all take together to try to either get this person some help or make sure that the organization is protected from a future act of violence. And that's really the biggest differentiator about this program. So look, you take the training, you're going to learn more about all of these different types of violence and different types of warning signs. We talked about domestic violence. Changes in behavior are probably one of the most significant red flags. You get a person who's kind of been social and a good performer and always on time, and all of a sudden now they're not. They're acting depressed. Maybe they are abusing substances. Big changes are something to always be mindful of. And also becoming aware, if you get the opportunity to learn that people, going back to those stressors we talked about earlier, that maybe someone recently went through a divorce or lost custody of a child or lost their home, lost a loved one. You know, we had so much loss during COVID, so many grieving people, and that all takes a toll. So we have to look at the whole picture, and at the same time, we're not also losing sight of the fact that just because people are under stress and just because they have these problems, again, it doesn't mean they're going to perpetrate an act of violence. We look at what are the mitigating factors in their life. You know, do they have someone that cares about them, positive role models? So this whole process of threat assessment and analysis, it's not simple, but it doesn't even begin if people don't come forward with what they're seeing. So with that, really quickly, and again, this will be information that we will provide to all of you in the form of some, you know, documentation and through the Beazley portal that's available, the monthly webinars we're doing. There are lots of opportunities for you to learn about how to enhance your violence protection program. And, you know, some of the key components are like this awareness training. We've been talking about the anonymous reporting, all of that, as well as, you know, taking a look at the policies you have, the plans. Do we have weapons policy, bullying, harassment? Do we do background checks? You know, the social media monitoring we talked about. And training is probably number one. When people say, you know, we don't have the budget to implement this type of a program, I will tell you that it's more about training your people than it is about, you know, buying equipment and putting in guards and gates and locks and RFID readers and, you know, all, not to say those things aren't important, but at the end of the day, you can have all the tools in the world, and if your people don't know what to do with them, you just don't get the value. So, and the last component, of course, is the insurance program that allows, you know, risk transfer with respect to the threat of violence. So with that, Lucy, I'm turning it back to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Susie. So one of the benefits of the Beazley policy that I just really want to draw everyone's attention to on the line here is something called circumstance. So this is so unique to Beazley and was developed 18 odd months ago when we, to Susie's point, looked at a number of the incidents that we were responding to and tried to identify, you know, what was that path? Like, what were those dots? And could we have done something further to prevent it? So we decided to create something that we think of as one step further than a threat. So it's basically anything that you deem reasonably likely to materialize into a deadly weapon event. So we basically say at that point that you notice something, that you're aware of something, call us. As Susie says, call us 24/7. Someone will be on the line at the other end of the phone, a person rather than a robot, because we want to understand what is that circumstance. Is it that, you know, as Susie said, you could have someone who was previously very outgoing and is now suddenly acting a bit depressed, and you know what, they could be going through a divorce, and we just want to try and understand what that situation looks like. Is it that you've ultimately, you know, had to let someone go and they're sort of making threatening comments or posting something on social media? Again, call us. When it comes down to a student, a popular student might suddenly be acting isolated in a playground. They might not be getting involved in the day-to-day sports games, and suddenly they could be just making quite aggressive commentary in their homework. Again, call us, because what we want is that ultimately, if we can do anything to prevent a deadly weapon event occurring, we want to do that. But we would also much rather you call us for 10 events that mean absolutely nothing than not call us for one event that becomes something. So it's extremely unique, and I cannot stress enough how much we want our insureds to really utilize that circumstance extension within the policy. We've had a number of situations where that has been used, and we have had crisis response included. We've covered social media monitoring, threat assessments, etc. So those costs then can be picked up under the Beazley Deadly Weapon Protection Policy as well. Next slide, please, Susie.
Great.
So when you get the policy, as Susie's mentioned, there's an abundance of information that you're automatically getting. I'm just going to give you some high-level detail as to what you automatically get access to as a Beazley client. So there is an element of before, during, and after an event. So that before an event occurs is crisis management services available post-finding to try and prevent an event occurring. So for us, it's access to regular webinars, such as bespoke webinars as these, or it could just be our monthly webinars that we host looking at lessons learned or particular trends we're seeing or any coverage issues. Depending on what topic we're discussing, will determine who we're working with. Crisis risk, Beazley, our claims teams, third parties. You name it, we'll get people involved. We want to start the conversation and just make people aware of what's happening on a day-to-day in terms of violence within the US and what they can purchase within the product. The next element that we have is a deadly weapon protection portal. So for us, this is where we basically say, we have this online website, you guys go on it and you access all our information that we put on there. It's videos, it's webinars, it's articles. Again, it's lessons learned, it's how to spot concerning behaviors, how often you should be updating your security protocols, what to do if someone makes a threat. All of that information is on there, and it can be utilized as a training resource internally, available to as many people within your company as you want. The other thing that we say on that Deadly Weapon Protection portal is that if there is something we are not addressing on there, ask the expert. i.e., there's a section on there for you guys to reach out to us and say, you know what, I've got something that's particularly nuanced to me or to my state or my industry, or a particular circumstance that I just want to ask someone about. If you don't want to ask us as a circumstance, then put it on the portal. And it comes to crisis risk, Beazley, and the claims team. We want to make sure that we have a consistent, open dialogue between the three of us and see whoever is the best person to